Uh, Let me present our tonight's feature presenter. I first met tonight's speaker in 2015 when my wife Mary and I were summering near Boone, North Carolina, and we went birding, and Curtis Smalling led the walk in Valley Cruces Park just outside of Boone, North Carolina. We found him to be incredibly knowledgeable and personable, and he literally could identify every unseen bird who vocalized just by its song. I remember one of the other participants on the walk fondly referring to him as the bird man of the area, which he certainly was. He was the director of land bird conservation for North Carolina Audubon at the time. Today, he is vice president with National Audubon and executive director of Audubon North Carolina. A long advocate for renewable energy, Curtis has been involved in wind and bird interactions for 2 decades, including service on the North Carolina's first wind working group and helping draft legislation and model local ordinances regarding wind energy in North Carolina. Tonight, Curtis will take us on a fascinating exploration of the golden-winged warbler, one of North America's most captivating songbirds. With over 2 decades of experience studying this species across the US, Nicaragua, and other parts of its wintering range, Curtis has uncovered remarkable insights into its behavior, habitat, and conservation needs. Tonight, Curtis reveals fascinating details about the golden-winged warbler's life, highlighting the collaborative work of researchers and conservationists, and discussing ongoing efforts to stabilize and conserve this beautiful species. So join me in welcoming Curtis Smalling, who I'm sure will delight and inform all of us with his presentation on chasing golden-winged warblers, current research, and conservation efforts. Curtis, please share your screen and begin your presentation when you are ready. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for having me this evening. My apologies. My voice is a little bit fluey left over from the Thanksgiving break. Scott and I were talking before I started. It seems like as soon as you get a couple of days off, your body says, "Okay, time for a break." So anyway, my apologies. I have my tea here handy and ready in case I need it. So again, thank you all so much for inviting me to speak to you guys this evening. My work now as executive director is a lot more administrative, and so this gives me a chance to, in some ways, relive some of my most fond memories of being in the field chasing this bird all over the hemisphere. I also wanted to just give a shout out. There's several people on the call that I know or have known, and Robin Diaz is on the call. Robin has actually helped us in the field with this project, so I wanted to say hello to Robin. I also wanted to just mention this beautiful picture, this portrait of a golden-winged warbler at a watering station in Nicaragua in the winter. It was taken by Don Mullaney, who many of you know and remember from his snowbird time every winter in South Florida. We miss Don a whole lot, but appreciate his photography even today. So golden-winged warbler, I'm going to see if you can hear this a little bit better. They do sing a buzzy kind of call, often hard to hear in the field. It's a hard bird to see a lot of times because of the habitat they like and the quietness of their song. But golden wings are a particularly pretty warbler. They are one of the rarer warblers that we have. And tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about the different parts of their life cycle, some of the basic biology around golden wings, and all of this with the backdrop of, why are so many people concerned in studying this species in such a energetic and focused way? One of the reasons for that is, golden wings are one of the less common warblers that we have. They've been on a pretty steady decline since the 1960s, losing about 70% of their global population since the 1960s. It has stabilized recently, the last 10 years or so, across its range, but has continued to decline across most of its range, although a little bit flatter in the northern portion of the range, and actually some increases as they move northward toward the boreal shield. The biggest declines are in the Appalachian Mountains, which is where I lived and worked on this species. I'm going to use a lot of North Carolina examples tonight, but this species was studied by a research collective that was organized by the Golden-winged Warbler International Working Group that was founded about 20 years ago. I meant to bring my 20-year anniversary ball cap that we all got this year. We were working on this species for a long time. And in fact, my career with Audubon started as a field surveyor doing golden-winged warbler surveys in Western North Carolina. I traveled to all 23 mountain counties in Western North Carolina in 2000, 2001, 2002, really trying to get a sense of what our population might look like here in North Carolina. But we continued to decline here in Western North Carolina and across most of the Southern Appalachians by about 10% in the last decade or so, which is not good. We feel like we have about 500 pairs of birds left in Western North Carolina. When we look at this map, you can see it looks like it's fairly evenly distributed, but in fact, 95% of the population, 95% of the global population exists in the Great Lakes area in southern Canada, and only about 5% is spread out over the Appalachian region. So when you see these pictures, I'm going to show you a couple more maps that get into that a little bit. It's important to remember that the declines are the steepest here where the bird is the rarest. It was petitioned for listing under the Endangered Species Act in 2010. And of course, a number of folks are, as I said, working on this species. A lot of academic partners and agency partners like the Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, and others, really trying to stem this decline and figure out what's causing it. So a lot of the research that was happening was trying to get at the root causes of those declines. The bird is distributed. This is an animation of a stem model from Cornell that shows the annual cycle. The darkest colors are the densest areas, so both winter and summer. In the winter, they're mostly a Central American bird, although, as we'll discuss, birds from the Southern Appalachians tend to winter in Columbia down here. So when you see this little bit of, it's hard to see, a little bit of this yellow in Columbia, those are mostly the birds from the Southern Appalachians. Most of the birds are trans-Gulf migrants, although the birds from the Southern Appalachians do tend to island hop. They drift down in the fall, they drift down Florida and island hop to go to Columbia rather than trans-Gulf to the Yucatan and the other parts of its range. We'll talk a little bit about migration in more detail, in quite a bit more detail a little bit later. These are two different maps. We're also going to talk about a very similar species, blue-winged warbler, because the biology of golden wings is intimately connected to blue-winged warbler. So these range maps for the entire annual cycle for both species are just to give you a sense of where they overlap and where they don't. Golden wings, again, most of the breeding is in this dark red that you see here, scattered pretty thinly throughout the Appalachians, but mostly around the Great Lakes. All this blue and yellow is migratory pathway stuff, and then the blue is the wintering range. You can see there's quite a bit of overlap between the two species as how they're distributed, although blue wings tend to be more common in the northern Appalachians and also in the central hardwoods. Golden wings tend to be a little bit farther north than blue wings. This kind of becomes important when we start to think about the hybridization and the genetics of both species. So we'll delve into that in a little bit more detail. I want to kind of level set you here with where we find these birds. Again, golden wings are most abundant in the Great Lakes region, 95% of the global population, which is only estimated at about 390,000 birds. That's not many. It's one of the few warbler species that we have that's kind of under 500,000 birds. Some of the other birds to compare it to, blue-winged warblers, about twice as many of those, close to 700,000 we estimate. Cerulean warblers, another species of high conservation concern, just for some perspective, has about 500,000 birds. Really rare stuff like Kirtland's warbler that everybody's kind of familiar with have less than 5,000 birds, so considerably rarer. Kalima warbler out west, about 20,000 birds. On the other end of the spectrum, you guys are probably welcoming your yellow-rumped warblers en masse this time of year. It's an estimated 170 million yellow-rumped warblers in North America, to give you some sense of perspective on just how rare golden wings might be. For a bird like in North Carolina, if we have less than 500 pairs, that's not very many birds at all. Again, on the wintering grounds, the really concentrated areas are Nicaragua and the Honduras. I've done quite a bit of work in Nicaragua on golden wings. We'll touch on that a little bit later. This is kind of a Rorschach test kind of map, but it shows you the breeding range of blue wings and golden wings kind of overlaying on top of each other. The black areas are where they overlap, and this becomes important when we start talking about modeling the future distribution of these birds because of climate change. We think that blue wings are going to shift north and east and start to occupy places like Maine, maybe, that they haven't occupied for centuries. But these birds have existed and coexisted and contracted and expanded and all those things for, we think, close to 100,000 years. And we feel like the species that these guys arose from diverged from the rest of the warblers and became the vermivora genus, as it's called, the worm-eating genus, probably 100,000 years ago or so. And so, this, while we see hybridization, all the rest of it, which we'll talk about in some detail here in just a second, this has happened before. We're seeing signs of it now, accelerating in certain places, declining in other places, but it complicates the biology of the species and the conservation of the species in some ways, as we're starting to understand what drives those kinds of hybridization rates and the success or failure or success or dominance of some of those, of which species in which area. Now, I want to go through kind of the hybrids that we're familiar with. And if you've birded much, you've probably seen some of the hybrids of these two birds. They're one of the most hybridizing sets of warblers, I guess. So golden wings is typical, and I may slip up and use some jargon on you, but if we say something is a phenotype, what we mean is this is kind of what it looks like, the characteristics that it shows, right? So a typical golden wing phenotype, this male in the upper left, has this nice black mask and throat. It's got broad golden wing bars where he gets his name. It's nice gunmetal gray on the back and a lighter gray on the tummy, a really nice yellow cap. The female down below mirrors that. She's just a little muted everywhere, but a similar pattern. Now, blue-winged warbler looks kind of strikingly different, right? A bright yellow body, a narrow black eye line, white wing bars, and gray to bluish wings, where it gets its name, but pretty different. The interesting thing with these birds, though, now that we've done a lot of genetic sampling on these birds range wide, and we've collected lots of genetic samples of this bird across its range, they are 99.97% the same genetically. So their genomes, their total genetic makeup has been mapped in both species, and they are only 0.03 different. And that's really all concentrated on 6 sites, 6 loci in their genetic code. Almost all of those gene differences relate to plumage, but there are some other differences. One of the most fascinating is that blue-winged warblers have a different migration pattern than golden wings. They also tend to like a slightly different habitat type, and that seems to be driven somehow by that little bit of genetic difference as well. Now, when these two species hybridize, you get some standard hybrids. The one that we think of a lot of times, and you'll see it with varying amounts of yellow here, is what we call a Brewster's. And if you look in your Sibley's Guide, for instance, it'll say this one with the most yellow here is going to be kind of a first generation bird. So if this mates with this, you get this. so this Brewster's, this F1 is kind of a commonly seen hybrid, especially during migration. If this bird back crosses or breeds with one of these parent phenotypes, you can get different hybrids as well. And for us on the breeding grounds in Western North Carolina, we get this golden-winged back cross. It's called an F2, which is also a Brewster's, but much cleaner, not very much yellow on it. Again, it's starting to have the kind of the dominant grays of the golden-wing again. Now, if we look at these hybrids, and you remember your kind of high school genetics, right? Some plumage characteristics are recessive, just like eye color in mammals or whatever. So if we look at these two birds, the recessive traits tend to be the yellow body, white wing bars, and the big bold mask of the golden wing. So those are recessive traits. If we have a bird that shows all of the recessive traits, it's really rare. Mendelian genetics says it shouldn't be more than a fourth of the birds out there of the offspring. It seems to be even rarer than that with golden wings. And you get what's called a Lawrence's warbler. Now, Lawrence's warbler is super rare. I spent 23 years in the field studying golden wings. I've seen two and only seen one on the breeding grounds. And this one is one that was on territory in Western North Carolina. So this double recessive, as we call it, that shows all the recessive traits, is super rare and hard to find. But really, really pretty bird. We were very excited when we had one on territory. Now, a lot of the work that we've done over the years with the research cooperative that we're with shows that these guys, both the Lawrences and the Brewsters, reproduce as frequently as the rest of the population. They're not discriminated against because they're hybrids. And one of the things we wanted to see was, with birds back crossing, and if you're in an area that's mostly golden wings, you're going to get these mostly gray back crosses. And if you're in a place with lots of blue wings, you're going to get more and more of the yellow type, as the recessive trait is much more common in those areas. So we wanted to do some research to really figure out, okay, if we've got these phenotypes, these what the birds look like, if we look at their genetic history, what can that tell us about the genotype? Like how frequent do birds hybridize and how common has it been across time? So one of the first big projects we undertook was to map the genomes, or the genotype versus phenotype of a lot of birds across the range. And what we found was that, in places like Western North Carolina, for instance, we were seeing about 10% of the birds were phenotypically hybrid, so about 10% showing up as a hybrid you could identify in the field. And then another 10% or 11% had latent genes from parents who at some point were hybrids, right? So really about 20% of the population had some history of hybridization. What we saw across the range of the species was the closer you got to the leading edge of the population, like in Canada for golden wings, these 100% bubbles that you see tend to be on that northern limit of the range heading north. The more pure blue-winged populations in the central hardwoods and stuff, not as much hybridization, just like the golden wings at the northern limit. But kind of everywhere in between, it was pretty consistent. 10 to 15% of the birds seemed to exhibit some kind of hybridization history. We felt like this was important because early on in research on golden wings in the 40s and 50s, a lot of folks felt like blue wings were dominant and they would outperform golden wings where they shared space. And so we saw golden wings disappear from places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island and New Jersey and Connecticut fairly quickly over 4 or 5 generations of birds. So from the 40s to the 60s, most golden wings had been lost there, and people saw this as a real threat to golden wings. What we've seen now is that it's a little more complicated, and where we see blue wings encroaching may have more to do with habitat condition and a lack of forest cover that allows blue wings to outcompete golden wings. And so where we have decent forest cover, golden wings seem to be able to hold their own. And when that forest cover drops below about 60% on the landscape, then we start to see blue wings get favored. One of the reasons for that, we think, is blue wings seem to tolerate conifers a lot better. Most of our golden wings don't really like conifers at all. We're going to talk a little bit in more detail about habitat here in just a minute. So when we're thinking about trying to conserve a species, and we've got all this stuff going on with golden wings, right? They're biologically, they're subject to this hybridization. They're very specific in their habitat needs. They're early successional young forest specialists. So as forests age, we tend to lose habitat. We don't necessarily lose the birds, but we lose the number of birds, right, as the habitat availability shrinks. All of this is happening, though, on the breeding grounds from our perspective, and there's a whole other part of the annual cycle that's happening too. So when we're thinking about conserving a species like this, we have to think about all the different parts of that, and also the lifespan of the birds. Like how many times do they get to try to have young? And for golden wings, the average life expectancy is about 3 years, but the longevity record is getting close to 8 years. The birds have high site fidelity, meaning they come back to the same locations to nest and breed every year. We now know that they also have high site fidelity on the wintering grounds. So they're going back to the same coffee plantations and stuff every year on the wintering range. So we wanted to look at things like, what are the vital rates, if you will? How many young are they producing? How many of those young are surviving the fledgling period to migrate away? How many of them are surviving migration? There was some early work done that suggested that golden wings were much more susceptible to window kills than some other species for whatever reason. So we need to dig into some of that stuff. What's happening on the wintering grounds? Is habitat being maintained or lost, or those kinds of questions? And how many of those birds are surviving that full cycle to come back and try to breed again? So getting some numbers attached to these points along that life cycle were really important to try to figure out, where is the best bang for our buck if we're going to, really try to influence the success of the species. So I want to start with the breeding season because that's where most of us as researchers started. It's where we had, grad students and all the rest of it and able to work. This is in the Appalachian Mountains in the Amphibolites up near Boone, North Carolina, where I did most of my research on golden wings. This is up on Elk Knob State Park, if any of you are up in that part of the world and visited Elk Knob before. They like early successional habitat or young forests. So these places where you see maples and hawthorns and stuff creeping into these old fields with briars and goldenrod and all the rest of it. This is the habitat they breed in. But they also use the adjacent forest, and that became really clear after the work that we did for a number of years, how important this adjacent forest is to the bird's success. Once they nest, and they do tend to nest out in the open, the young forest without much tree canopy, it's very, very dense. It's very dense by the end of the nesting cycle. Now, when they're first laying their eggs, it's not very dense at all because we're at fairly high elevation. So the female is picking a place to build the nest that's going to grow and develop over time while the young are in the nest being fed. So she's pretty particular about what she wants and where she's going to put it. And in fact, some of the other researchers in our cooperative started to look at where nests were placed. And what they found was that early nests that have the most eggs are placed fairly close to the forest edge. We'll talk about why in just a minute. But if that nest fails for some reason, the second clutch is actually put out in the early successional farther away from the forest. It kind of ensures a higher likelihood of fledging if they're out in the middle of these big patches. But after they leave the nest, they head to the forest. So they have a little bit more exposure. So interesting choices that the females are making. It is dense, though, and you can see this is Alex, one of our techs. The goldenrod and stuff is higher than her head by the end of June for second and third clutches if other attempts have failed. This is really, really dense habitat. I used to tell my techs when I hired them, they had to get used to working in 200-acre briar patches because that's what golden wings like, and we would run through lots of pairs of pants and shirts and boots over the course of the summer. Very dense habitat, but necessary and important to keep the young as safe as possible. We found by doing thousands of vegetation plots, and this is across the range of the species. There's whole groups of researchers in Michigan and Minnesota and Tennessee and other places doing the same exact studies to try to figure out what is it that's driving golden-winged warbler success or failure. We found that places where they put the nest tended to be much denser than the rest of the early successional, and tended to have more saplings and shrubs, also less grass, but a lot of forbs, a lot of the flowering plants, if you will, and not as much briar as some of the rest of the place. There were some interesting things, though, that the females seemed to pick and focus in on. Almost every place that we found a nest, she had what we started to call a fire pole. She had a woody stem that was right next to the nest. And as we watched how she incubated and fed young and stuff, she would usually land on that really stiff woody stem and walk her way down to the nest. The male was not quite as dedicated to that system, and so he would often fly in from lots of different directions. But the female, when she's the one building the nest, she would put that nest at the base of one of those woody stems, we think to allow her to land and find the nest in this super dense habitat. The basics of the habitat, though, is, this early successional or this young forest, this 200-acre briar patch, needed to be in a landscape context that was forested. So more than 70% of the surrounding area needed to be kind of mature forest. It had to have this really high percentage of forbs, or the weedy species, grasses and shrubs and saplings. But the canopy couldn't be closed out where they wanted the nest. It needed to be less than 30%. So that the trees needed to be young and allow a lot of sunlight. And for golden wings, they did not like conifers at all. And so the percentage of conifers in the stand had to be less than 10%. For blue wings and other parts of the range, that could be as high as 50%. So blue wings seem to have a much higher tolerance for conifers. We wanted to try to understand, once we knew some really basic things about the habitat, we were trying to figure out, so how do we really figure out in this really dense habitat how they're using that habitat? And so Robin can speak to this, but one of the ways that researchers do this is we do what's called spot mapping, right? Where you follow the birds around. We catch them, put bands on their legs so we know it's the same bird. So have color bands and a regular band, and technicians follow them around and try to get about 70 to 100 registrations of seeing this bird, identified to individual, where it's at. We map that, and that's called the spot mapping method. But we knew that birds used more than just what we saw in what really is the core of their territory, right? So we put transmitters on some birds, some short-range transmitters. Again, golden wings only weigh 9 grams if they're fat. And so all these transmitters have to be really small, less than half a gram, which means they don't transmit very far. So you had to follow them around and find where they went. But it yielded some interesting results. So on this map from a territory, a larger patch of habitat, the solid lines are the core spot map territories. This is where technicians and volunteers would see the bird and map where it was spending its time. So these are 3 different territories. The dotted line is what was identified after having telemetry on a bird. So some birds, like this one down in the bottom right, had really high quality territories, didn't have to fly very far to get what they needed. This bird in the middle was using a lot of this, really what's too open. This is more like pasture land, right? So this bird was using this entire space. This became important as we started to look at the genetics of birds and kind of nest survival and all the rest of it. Because what we found was, like a lot of songbirds, golden wings like to have neighbors, right? They like to have birds close by. And we see this a lot with grassland birds, right? Where you need enough habitat to have multiple eastern meadowlarks or multiple grasshopper sparrows, or whatever, in close proximity. One of the reasons for that is because a lot of our songbirds like extra pair paternity, it's called, or extra pair copulation. So a lot of these birds would spend part of their day slipping off and basically copulating or having sex with other birds so that some of their genetic material is actually being shared and raised by somebody else, right? And so with golden wings, we found that about 30% of nests contain eggs not fathered by the male that was going to be feeding those chicks, right? So part of the daily time budget, if you will, for males was, if I'm going to kind of grossly oversimplify this, they would spend the first hour or two defending this smaller territory, like singing, traveling around, different song perches, singing, protecting that core territory. Then they would spend about 2 hours, say from 8 to 10, not singing very much. And that was important because we always wondered, like, why are they so hard to find mid-morning? It was mostly because they were slipping off trying to have these extra pair copulations during the first part of the breeding season. So the males would be traveling around and crossing into other males' territories, basically, and copulating with the females. Then we would see later with fledglings that 20% to 40% of the young in that nest would have genetics from a neighboring bird. Now, they don't go as far as like tree swallows where females will egg dump in other females' nests and all that kind of stuff. So it's not a true commune situation, but the males are, spreading out their genetic material, as it were. And this is important if you've got one guy over here that's a blue-winged, right? He's going to hybridize and spread that hybrid genetic material to several different pairs, even if he's not paired with a different bird. This might be a blue-winged male and female, but there's going to be hybrids appear in some of these other nests. So it's one of the things that drives that hybridization. So a little bit about the nesting cycle. So these are golden wings. They're so cute, I must say, and the nests are so hard to find. It's always such a joy to find one. They build a platter of leaves on the ground, usually in dense cover, usually a kind of a rosette, like of ironweed or something that's coming up in the spring. They would put that platter of leaves in the base of that, again, looking for a woody stem for the female to be close to that so she could, come and go on that. And then build the finer material nest on that platter. Usually 6 eggs in the first clutch, 4 eggs in the second clutch if they need it. And then if that one failed, only 1 or 2 eggs by the third clutch. Most of you probably know that most songbirds are what we call determinate layers, meaning they have a set number of eggs they can lay per annual cycle. And so for golden wings, that seems to be about 10 or 12 eggs. That's important because if the first nest fails because of a late snowstorm or heavy storms or high predation rates or whatever, you lose a lot of your best productivity by losing those nests early in the season. Now, the young develop really quickly. They go from incubation is only about 9 days, and then they're only in the nest about 10 days. So they go from hatchling like this up to fledgling like this just in 10 days. So it's quick, and it also makes it hard to find nests because they're not in the nest for very long. Gets pretty crowded, so they leave pretty quickly. Super dense habitat, so they tend to leave and stay fairly close to the nest for the first day or two. This is the most challenging time for them. We had really high nest survival rates, like 80% of our nests fledged young, but 80% of those young were predated within the first 9 days post-fledging. So once they left the nest, that was the dangerous time. We put telemetry on some young birds to see what happens with them when they leave the nest and to see what's preying on them. How are the parents dealing with kind of continuing to feed? As you also know, most parents are going to feed the young the first 2 weeks out of the nest, usually about equivalent to however long they were in the nest. They get fed by the parents outside the nest. The young are flighted, but not strongly flighted, so they spend a lot of time climbing around in the brush. But interestingly enough, with golden wings, because they're nesting here in the early successional, What was kind of a surprise was they very quickly, as quickly as they can, kind of take the young into the mature forest. So they get them out of this area out here because this is kind of where a lot of predation happens, right? There's mammal predators, but there's also other predators. And what we found in Western North Carolina and Tennessee, in Pennsylvania, the largest predator of golden-winged chicks was chipmunks. Didn't even know they ate meat, but that was our biggest predator on baby golden wings. In Tennessee, which was a hotter, drier, fire-dependent site, snakes were the biggest predator, and copperheads were the main predator of golden wings in Tennessee. A couple of other really interesting things happened with the nesting cycle. Once a nest hatched and you had 5 or 6 young out there, the male and female parents split the brood. It's called brood splitting. And one of the parents would take care of 2 or 3 of the young. The other parent would take care of 2 or 3, the rest of the clutch. And they would separate and go opposite directions. And so this is one track of one fledgling on this map here. But if you overlay all those, the mother might take them one direction, the dad would take them another direction. As in most things associated with the young, the female was much better at making sure they survived. She would move the chicks into the woods quicker than the males and usually take them deeper into the woods faster. But they would go as far as 300 meters into dense forest, into the mature forest, and get them out of the woods. Also, interestingly, after about 9 days, which is when most of the young are like really fully flighted, like they can fly almost as good as their parents by that 9-10 day, they would come back together as a family on that kind of day 10. I guess reassess. If 80% of them had been predated, you'd be down to 1 or 2 chicks by that point for each parent, maybe even less. If none of the chicks survive, they might lay a second nest. And get started again. But that's a really, really dangerous, critical time. But again, if your goal is to replace yourself during your lifetime, and you're going to return and do this 3 or 4 times over your lifetime, having 1 or 2 chicks survive each summer probably replaces yourself over that same time frame, right? So nature is good at producing as overabundance, right? And it's often very hard to change that trajectory of kind of having enough overabundance that survives to make the population increase. It's why conservation work is hard and takes a long time, because nature is kind of set at almost a steady state sometimes about what's possible. Out of all this work that we were doing, it really was to try to inform best management practices so that people like the National Forest Service or landowners who are working with NRCS would know what to do to try to create better habitat for the bird. And so our working group produced a number of materials that have informed cost share practices with the Working Lands for Wildlife program and the EQIP program within NRCS. We use these guidance to work on public lands like state parks and other landowners. But that's only part of the story, right? I mean, golden wings arrive with us in late April and leave by Labor Day. So the rest of the year, something else is happening, right? And so our research collective was also interested in what was happening then. Oh, and I should say all of these materials are available at our website for the working group, and it's just gwwa.org, the alpha code for goldenwings.org. And the other nice thing about all this work is, golden wing habitat is really good habitat for lots of other things, from rose-breasted grosbeaks to chestnut-sided warblers, common yellowthroats. Vesper sparrows are often in high elevation sites where the shrubland grades into grasslands. So there's a number of other species that benefit from knowing what's going on in these habitats as well. But we really wanted to turn some attention to what was happening elsewhere for the rest of the life cycle. What was happening on the wintering grounds became a kind of the next easiest target, right? We knew kind of where the birds occurred in general. We knew most of them were in Central America, some were in Colombia. We didn't really know the linkages, like which birds were going where. There had been some work on stable isotope stuff in feathers that suggested that most of the birds in Central America were coming out of the Great Lakes. But that was hard to determine because everything's so compressed there as far as distribution. We also, again, had these hints that golden wings might be more susceptible to window collisions and stuff during migration. These are all birds from a single event that's on the slide here. So we had an offshoot of the working group, Alianza a las Doradas, which was working on wintering ground issues, and we still work on wintering ground issues for us in North Carolina, down in Nicaragua on our partner sites there, even though our birds, as it turns out, tend to go to Colombia. But the bird habitat looks pretty similar. This is a shot from Nicaragua. It looks early successional and shrubby, but it's got a lot of the same issues happening, for this habitat as is happening for us in the U.S. There's changes in how land is used, whether it's converting to coffee, whether that coffee conversion is to shade coffee or sun coffee, and how those sites are managed and how much primary forest remains and all the rest of those things. The change in agricultural practices away from subsistence to grazing kinds of approaches in Central America has had a huge impact. And in a lot of sites, like our birds in Colombia, only 7% of the montane oak forest that they depend on in Colombia remains. The rest of it has been cut over and converted to secondary forest. So really understanding that and spending a lot of time down there trying to figure out what was going on, just like we were doing on the breeding grounds, became really important. So we worked with a number of partners there and still do on reforestation and other efforts to try to figure that out. It's, a much poorer system than in the US. And so things that we would normally do here sometimes are more difficult to do, sometimes easier, but more difficult to do. And, for the core of the range, and these little bubbles that are going to pop up, the top number is the annual change in forest cover. So Costa Rica, as we'd expect, has done a great job at reforesting Costa Rica. Been changing at about 1% positive per year over the last couple of decades. And now Costa Rica is 51% forested. Belize, similar result, and it's still 61% forested. But the rest of Central America, and you see the red bubbles, has been declining in their forest. And the core of Golden Wing range, Honduras and Nicaragua in particular, are losing forest faster than the other parts of Central America. And now in Nicaragua, where I work, 20 years ago, Nicaragua was 80% forested, 40 years ago in 1980. Nicaragua was 80% forested, and today it's only 24% forested. So a tremendous amount of forest loss in Nicaragua, which can also, again, drive some of those annual cycle parts of the equation for golden wing conservation. Again, the core of the range in the winter is Honduras and Nicaragua, Costa Rica into Panama, and then for us, these high elevation forests in Colombia. But one of the challenges, if they have high site fidelity, so you kind of know where they winter and you know where they summer, but you don't necessarily know who's doing that where. And you also don't know how they're getting there. You don't know much about migration. And so one of the challenges with golden wing work and with all songbird work really was to get things small enough so that we could start to answer those questions. And I've really count myself fortunate to have been working at a time when the technology really got small and we could do things that we hadn't been able to do in the past. The very first project we did was using light level geolocators, which is what's on the back of this bird. You see it doesn't have an antenna. It's just a little light level sensor. And if any of you in the room are a sailor, you know that if you know the exact time of sunrise and sunset, you pretty much can get within about 50 kilometers of your latitude and longitude if you know the date and the time of sunset and sunrise. And so what this little unit does, it wraps around their legs. You can see the little harness at the top up here. This loops around their legs. This sits on their upper back, kind of between the wings. All it does is record that. And then because they have high sight fidelity, we could put these on in Nicaragua. They'd fly off to wherever they were going to go. We'd come back the next winter, catch them again, pull these off, download the data. We did the same thing at 475 birds in the U.S. We put them on almost 300 birds on the wintering grounds. And then we would recapture them the next year. And usually we could recapture about 50% of the birds that we had tagged. There had been study for the first couple of years to make sure that birds were returning at just as high a rate as the birds who didn't have any of this extra weight. And in fact, in the original studies, birds carrying these came back at a higher return rate than the birds who weren't. We don't know why that is, but we joke that maybe it's like being in training, right? Carrying a little bit extra weight. It'd be like carrying ankle weights when you walk every morning or something. We can't exceed 5% of body mass, which meant that for a 9-gram bird, they had to be less than 0.45 grams, which is really tiny. It's less than what a paperclip weighs. Some interesting things came out of that, right? So once we had birds, we found out that the Southern Appalachians, Tennessee, and the Cumberlands up to Pennsylvania, most of the birds that returned went all the way down to Columbia. And this is how we finally resolved the notion that Southern Appalachian birds are part of that small population that goes down to Columbia. And most of the birds that are in the Great Lakes go to this cinder part of Central America. So we kind of, firmly established that seemed to be what was happening. But in one of the most interesting and fascinating pieces of the puzzle of this, we really found out something quite remarkable by accident. And I want to walk you through this. So I have some colleagues that work in the Cumberlands, Dave Bueller and his team at University of Tennessee, Knoxville. They had put some of the first geolocators on birds in the Cumberlands, and they were eagerly awaiting the return of birds. This is in 2015. And this was the arrival date. So you've got a group of technicians, grad students out in the field, coming every day, looking to see, are the birds back yet? And they wanted to let a bunch of them get back, and then they're going to start recapturing them, pulling the data off of them. So over the course of almost 2 weeks, the birds trickled back. They had 5 tagged birds that they knew were on site by April 27th. And this was kind of eventually, once the data was retrieved, these were the tracks of those birds, right? So from the perspective of the folks on the ground, all these birds came back. We know that the day before the 27th, this guy was still pretty far away, but overnight he came in from Louisiana. The next day, there was a lot of storms coming. In fact, it became Tennessee's worst tornadic outbreak in 150 years. So the students didn't work, right? It was getting too dangerous, too stormy. Once they recovered the eventual data, though, what we found was on the 27th, this blue guy, he left again. He had been there, but he left. The green guy arrived, this guy left. The next day, 28th, they had all left and gone back south, spread back out, trying to get to the coast to avoid all this mess. On the 29th, the tornadoes were still coming through. The birds had gotten really consolidated in Florida, especially in the panhandle. This orange guy, he was more scared than everybody else. And by the 30th, he had gone all the way back to Cuba and was waiting out the storm. By the 1st of May, they had started to re-arrive. The storms had passed. Grad students were back in the field. It was still kind of rainy. By the 2nd, they were all back. From the graduate students' perspective, they had never left, right? The last day in the field, they were all 5 there. First day in the field, they were all 5 there. So they started recapturing them and downloading their data. And that's only then did they realize that the birds had come back from a long migration, but then returned back to the Gulf to avoid the storm system. And even more fascinating was when they started looking at the weather records for the site. there wasn't a noticeable change in the weather yet. When the birds departed, the barometric pressure had not dropped yet in advance of the storm or any of that stuff. So something had cued the birds in that something bad was coming. We do know now that a lot of small birds, they have pneumaticized bones and air sacs, and so they're very sensitive to barometric pressure, very sensitive to barometric pressure. But it also makes them sensitive to subtones, to loud, low, booming noises that travel hundreds of miles across the U.S. sometimes. It's why we think a lot of birds and animals are sensitive to earthquakes before we feel or sense that they're coming. They may actually hear it instead of feel it. So that we still don't know exactly how they knew and why they left, but they did, and they came back. And again, from the observers on the ground, it didn't look like anything had happened. Now, with the rest of geolocators being put on almost all small birds, because now they've gotten small enough to put them on black-throated blues and you name it. Almost every bird species has had geolocators and geotags and nanotags and all the rest of it put on them. We're finding a lot of birds move around a lot more than we thought they did. Just like that telemetry of the territories, where from an observer, the territory was pretty small. We were seeing that core territory. But the technology is letting us see a much broader view. The technology has continued to improve, and so now we use nanotags. This is a golden wing with a nanotag. This is Amy Tomcho, one of our biologists. She's with American Forest Foundation now, but we were putting nanotags on, which are detectable at MODIS towers. Many of you are probably familiar with MODIS towers. This is Clifton Avery, one of our partners with the Wildlife Resources Commission. So we put tags in North Carolina, but part of, again, a larger cooperative effort in the early 2020s to see where some of our other birds were going and how they were getting there. Sometimes the geolocators don't give us a good sense of where the places in between are. They don't stay in one place long enough to get a very accurate measurement. But MODIS towers, they ping in a precise location. So 2 of our birds from North Carolina stopped with you guys. One at St. Mark's at the Wildlife Refuge, and I can't even say Chasahawitska. One of them stopped there for a little while too. So the technology continues to improve, and we continue to find out more and more about this kind of the black box time, the time that birds are on the move, that it's been really hard for us to figure out what's going on there. All of these things then hopefully inform conservation efforts. What are the important stopover sites? What are the places that birds are spending more of their annual cycle budget of time? Where are the pinch points where they might be more at risk? So we work closely with landowners and land managers, using NRCS cost share programs in particular, to do things like farmers who aren't as interested perhaps in managing timber, but are interested in maintaining habitat that's suitable for golden wings. We've got a number of active partnerships with private landowners and with public lands to help us advance the work of golden wings. And I'll just give you a couple quick North Carolina examples. The working group that we're part of, has established goals for every state where golden wings exist. And so for North Carolina, we have a goal of 24,000 acres. This would be enough habitat to double our golden wing population in North Carolina if we're not constrained by things like how many are surviving over winter and things like that. So we don't know yet if we build enough habitat, if it will get filled or not, because we don't exactly know where all the pinch points are. These are all the locations of known spots for golden wings, and we tend to focus our effort around those places so we get recruitment, hopefully. Most of these private land projects are for maintenance. We try not to cut a lot of trees down to make even more early successional habitat than we need. There's a lot of early successional habitat on the land right now that's not occupied by golden wings, and so how do we make all of that better so that it's more usable? On public lands like national forest and national park lands, half of our goal there is to maintain habitats. The other half can be created through active timbering and things that are happening on the forest already, just tweaked to make it have a lifespan for golden wings. We typically try to stitch together willing landowners and public lands. The red pieces are properties that have management plans for golden wings, for instance, in my home county, Watauga, and up in Ashe. And this allows us then to have population centers, right, where the birds have neighbors, and you allow for that cross-pollination, if you will, extra pair copulations and all the rest of it. We're at enough forest cover where we don't have a huge problem with blue wings yet, and all those kinds of issues that we talked about earlier. But hopefully this gets us to a place where, over time we have enough habitat in place where we stabilize the population and allow it to grow. It's fairly stable thanks to efforts like this around the Great Lakes, and we're hoping that in the Southern Appalachians, by working both here and in the wintering grounds, we can start to move that needle. And as Audubon would say, kind of bend the bird curve, right? We want to bend this decline. That slow halting and reversing is a challenge and takes a lot of work and a lot of people working together. But we're confident we can get there. This is a snapshot just of national forest land, and the yellow and fuchsia spots are places where there are active plans in place for golden wing management on the forest. Places that we have influenced the decisions on. Hopefully over time, we'll see recruitment in these places. We have a new opportunity and a devastating opportunity. Many of you who've been to Western North Carolina know that Hurricane Helene created early successional habitat in a way that we've never seen in our lifetimes. 820,000 acres of canopy removing disturbance in Western North Carolina due to Hurricane Helene. This is just one spot, but we have, again, almost 1 million acres that were impacted like this across Western North Carolina. We have 60,000 acres of stream sides that have been scoured to bedrock. Those are going to take decades to recover if they do, right? They're going to change and hopefully be resilient and grow new forests and all the rest of it. But in that interim, we're working really hard to try to influence the salvage logging operations to allow for golden wings to colonize some of this new habitat that's going to be created. It's a huge opportunity, but it's a devastating opportunity. And as somebody who's from the region, it makes me tear up to think about how much of our timber we lost during that one event. In the space of 24 hours, to think about losing that much timber is hard to fathom. But Audubon and lots of other partners are working on this, and we had people in the field this past season assessing known locations. We've got another team of folks that we're bringing on in the spring to survey some of these new opportunity areas for golden wings, see if golden wings have already started to move into a few, or are there places where we can encourage that, where we're in close proximity. So anyway, I just wanted to let you know that we're thinking hard about Helene recovery and how to, if we've got this much timber on the ground, we've got to take advantage of it and make as much good habitat for these early successional species as we can, with an eye toward recovering the forest, right? We don't need that much early successional habitat. We need our forest back. But there's going to be a long interval here where it can be good golden wing habitat. With that, I'd just like to encourage you, you guys play an important part for my golden wings in North Carolina. Florida is where they stop. It's where they go when the bad storms are coming. It's how they get to Columbia. So the work that you're doing as an Audubon chapter, and that my colleagues in Audubon, Florida, Julie Rathmel and her team are doing down there impacts the work that I'm trying to do in North Carolina. So I really appreciate the work that y'all are doing, the work on native plants, providing great stopover habitat for all these migrants that pour through Florida. It really is urgent and important work, and really appreciate all the effort that your chapter and all the other chapters are putting forward. It takes all of us. Birds are under a lot of challenges on almost all parts of that life cycle. And for birds like golden wings that have declined so much, now is kind of our opportunity to try to reverse that. So thank you all so much for your time and your attention, and I'll be more than happy to answer what questions I can answer. That's a lot of information to take in an hour, but appreciate your attention, and thank you so much. With that, Scott, I'll let you pepper me with questions, I hope.
Okay, well, let's see what kind of questions we get. Thank you so much, Curtis. That was a great presentation. Really appreciate the all the attention to detail that you gave, and Incredibly informative. When one of the last things you talked about was Hurricane Helene and the effect it had on the North Carolina forest. I was also thinking back to 2018 and Hurricane Michael that devastated the Panhandle. And I wonder if that affected the population as well. Because I know you mentioned that their population, when found in Florida, is usually in the Panhandle.
Right. Yeah. And, all those really important stopover locations. And we do see, especially with Motus towers now, a number of birds do spend a few days. And we know from, for instance, the work in the Gulf, Dolphin Island, and work with hummingbirds that, a number of these migrants pile up, as it were, right at the edge of the Gulf and spend, wait for weather conditions to make it so that a Gulf crossing is safer and possible. In fact, I meant to mention, I've been fortunate to be a co-author on about 20 papers on golden wings, and we just had our what we think is our last paper out of all this geolocator work and stuff was just published 2 weeks ago. In that paper, we used geolocator data to talk about how golden wings time their migration across the Gulf. And what we found is that in the fall, when they aren't in a hurry, the most important factor is winds aloft. They wait until there's really favorable tailwinds to push them to Central America and South America. In the spring, winds have hardly anything to do with their decision to leave. It's mostly barometric pressure, and they evidently are queuing off on what the storm situation is like for the spring before they decide to take out over the Gulf. And again, for one species, that seems to be the model of what they're doing. Again, but all of that really important habitat in the Panhandle in particular, it gives birds a chance to rest and refuel before they're going to take that big last journey across the Gulf is super important. And I'm sure big storms that affect the forest in those areas, has an impact, whether short-term or long-term or both, so.
Speaking of storms, that was fascinating when you mentioned those May storms that caused the warblers to kind of retreat, and
Right.
one actually flew across the Gulf. And so is that, and I know your specialty, your area of research is the golden-winged warbler, but is that common in other warblers as well? Will they do that too?
Yeah, so now that there's been more geolocators and nano tags and stuff put on birds, we're finding that our original kind of dogma around migration was, it's such an arduous journey, and they put on all this fat, and so then once they've flown, especially in the spring when they're in a hurry, once they come all the way back, they need time to rest and recharge and refuel. And what we're finding is that's not necessarily true. And some of the other work on golden wings and blue wings in particular, we always wondered, so the majority of the golden wing population nests around the Great Lakes, and they usually arrive the second week in May. But sometimes the second week in May, there's 2 feet of snow on the ground. And so how do they know? Is it time to go yet or not or whatever? And now with the nano tag and the geotag work, we know they actually just fly up there and look. And if it's not good, they turn around and come back. Right. So they'll fly up there and then they'll come back to Kentucky or Illinois and wait 4 more days and then fly back up. So they've got such amazing metabolisms. We always, I think we look at something that weighs what 2 quarters weigh, and we think there's no way they have enough energy, to fly 1,000 miles or 400 miles and then turn around and just turn around and come back and do it again 2 days later. But they do. We see them at really productive stopover sites, and this has been known for a long time. They'll show up, in a hammock on the coast, completely without any visible fat, having lost some of their muscle mass. And when you catch them in the morning, that's their condition. You catch the same bird 12 hours later, and he's got visible fat, in his furcular notch or whatever. They're really great at re-energizing, laying more fat back on. They have a really fast metabolism. So if they're given the resources, they really can, do amazing things. I mean, you think about the long distance travel of shorebirds from, 5 days nonstop out over the open ocean, those kinds of things. It's amazing what they can do. And fortunately, the technology is showing us that, every time we think we have it figured out, a bird does something else that surprises us and goes beyond what we thought they could do. So,
Yeah, that is amazing. You mentioned the total population is estimated currently at around 390,000 right now. Uh, and I know that so many species in North America have seen their population decline and by up to 40% or more. Do you have a sense of the historical numbers that golden wings may have had like 40, 50 years ago?
yeah, and that's actually a great question. It's been a point of debate among the golden wing community, the working group community for a long time, because a lot of folks have kind of posited that, if you look at the history, in particular of logging, say, at the rise of the industrial logging era from 1880s to 1930, say, where most of the Appalachians was cut, most of the central hardwoods was cut, that when the breeding bird survey started in the 1960s, we may have been at the crest of a much larger golden wing population that ever existed kind of pre-settlement, right? That perhaps golden wings benefited from that industrial logging. And so what we were seeing in this slow, steady decline was a reset to more natural numbers. And we don't know if that's true, but golden wings have always been adaptive to these early successional habitat pieces, right? So when there's not a lot of active logging in an area, for instance, they will use a lot of wetlands, which are more or less a permanent early successional stage, right? Like a bog system or a tamarack system in Michigan or whatever. Just the wetness of it keeps it a certain successional stage. But that's not hundreds of millions of acres of habitat usually, right? There's a lot of forests and there's these specialized pockets. We also see them in riparian corridors in North Carolina. They're along the New River and the French Broad and places like that. So using these riparian zones, which also kind of are naturally maintained as early successional. And those were probably the places that would, if you think about a period with very little fire, very little disturbance, those areas probably were the core of the population, right? And then as disturbance happened, like Helene or what other natural events, you would get these population increases, and then they'd reset back to that level. What we're finding now is that a lot of the early successional habitat that seems to be created with what we do with the environment, think urbanization and stuff, isn't the specific kind of habitat that golden wings like and use. And the loss of landscape level forest also is detrimental to them. We see their numbers really tank if a creek shed, for instance, gets below 60% forested. They just stop showing up. They eventually wink out of those locations, and it's really hard to recolonize those places especially after urbanization. Right, those are kind of permanent losses for this species.
Yeah. And that's unfortunately the norm right now, which is
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. I'm sorry.
Now, I was going to say there's a really interesting paper just came out a couple of months ago that looked at the 3 billion birds report,
Right.
the loss of 3 billion birds, and really, started to dig into this notion that, the bulk of those declines have been in the most common species, right? So, 15% of that 3 billion is just in starlings and house sparrows, right? So a lot of the most common things have lost the biggest numbers, which makes sense because they were at these kind of near 100% carrying capacity. You think about cardinals or something like that. There's cardinal habitat kind of everywhere until there's not, until it's a parking lot or a high rise or whatever. And so the majority of the numerical losses of birds have been in these really saturated kind of full carrying capacity kind of habitats that we're losing so quickly right now. the whole Piedmont Crescent, all the urban corridors in all the states. That's the habitat we're losing like mad. Golden wings can decline. In North Carolina, I can lose 50% of them, and it's only 250 birds, right? But if I lose 50% of my American crow population, it's millions of birds, right? So, anyway.
Yeah. It was interesting also speaking of, kind of loss of birds, the predation on the fledglings. I was amazed when you said the chipmunks were like the chief uh, bird, the chief animal predating on them. It was like the chipmunks.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that was fascinating. That was a great new knowledge. My opinion of chipmunks has now changed.
They evidently take full advantage of that fledgling period. And we saw it there's a lot of co-occurring species in these really dense habitats. They kind of bring the birds to these nursery areas. So you'll get a few golden wings that are staging till the parents move them to the woods, but lots of field sparrows, lots of chestnut-sided warblers, lots of common yellowthroat chicks. And they'll all be in there together, and I think it makes them a little easier, especially for chipmunks, fast, can climb.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and super high density, like in the amphibolites, there's something like 80 chipmunks per acre. So I mean, they're super dense, and they're taking advantage of that little pulse of protein, I guess. So I hate to say it that way, but that's.
I know. No, it's we yeah, it's a cycle. Curtis, that's all the questions, but I do have a lot of compliments. Robin Diaz, who you mentioned, thank you for joining us, Robin. Fascinating presentation. Thank you, Curtis. Can a donation to Audubon, North Carolina be designated to a specific project?
Yes, it can. Certainly can. And if you are interested in that, it's probably best to reach out to me. And I'm just curtis.smalling at audubon.org. So we can make sure it gets credited where you want it to be credited. But anything, especially for folks out of state, Audubon tends to count donations based on the home zip code of where the donation was made. So it's always good to have somebody that knows it's coming. So, but yeah, we would love that. Thank you for asking.
So that's Curtis. I'm sorry, that's Curtis.Smalling at Audubon.org.
.org.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. And so Ann Wiley says, excellent, fantastic information. Thank you. Chuck Weber, yes, great information, fascinating. Thank you. Pat Eltz, terrific, fascinating, and informative presentation. Thank you. David Simpson, very interesting. I learned a lot. A great presentation that Susan Young says. Thank you. Consuelo Lopez de Mesa, thank you. Great job. Mickey Marshall, great presentation. Thank you. So lots of compliments all the way around, Curtis. I couldn't agree more. We really, really appreciated you joining us tonight, and particularly since you're not feeling well, and we hope you feel better.
I'm much better than I was Thanksgiving Day, so I'm on the mend.
Yeah, well, because it's time to get back to work, of course.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So you're on the mend.
Right.
Thanks, Curtis, and hopefully we'll have you back in the future again. I know your work spans more than just golden-winged warblers, and I'm sure there are other subjects that our audience would be interested in, and you're a great presenter. So we really enjoyed having you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you all so much.
Sure. Take care, Curtis.
All right. Mm-hmm.
Wait, one slide. So thank you, everybody. Hang on, let me just find the right slide. It switched all of a sudden. Problems tonight. Okay, there's my thank you slide. Sorry, I'm having trouble. Anyway, thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. Join us on January 6th for Dr. Michael Webster, who is the director of the Macaulay Lab at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, who will be giving us a wonderful presentation about the lab and particularly on Merlin, its history, its current where it's currently at and where it hopes to go in the future. And I'm sure since most of us are using Merlin, probably much more than we should be trying to teach our ear better on how to hear birds. But Merlin is such a great app, and we'll have a chance to learn much more about it. Anyway, have a wonderful winter holidays, and we hope to see you next year on January 6th. Take care, everybody. Bye bye.